Hey, welcome back. My name's Joel Duff, and today, well, we need to talk about the angst that's within young Earth creationism and talk about um, a progress report, a status report for young Earth creationism 2025. Yeah, a lot's been going on. And I mentioned that there is a new journal that has just begun that for young Earth creationists. And this journal is begun by a number of creationists that I've been calling the new creationists, and others have sort of identified as a sort of a subsect or a splinter group or a new movement within young Earth creationists. Take your pick. And this new journal, I mentioned in This Week in Creationism that I would talk about or go through a couple of the articles that are in the inaugural edition of New Creation Studies. All right. New Creation Studies is this new peer reviewed journal from Young Earth Creationists. And look at here. One of the first articles is Do We Need Another Creationist Journal from Todd Wood? That's not the one we're going to look at today. I've chosen to start with Hans Madueme's article, Some Reflections on the State of Creationism. And he has some very insightful things to say. And just to give it a little bit of a way, he's actually going to mention me in the article and some of the things I've said about the new creationism. And so let's see how he uses my words and my reflections on the new creationists. And he throws in a whole bunch of additional thoughts about what it means to be sort of on the new wave of creationism. Whatever your thoughts may be about this new creationism, this article is going to give you some real insight into what's happening in the young Earth creationist world. And that's why I'm going to spend some time reading some highlights from this article. So without further ado, let's get to it. Hans Madueme's Some Reflections on the State of Creationism. So who is Hans Madueme? I mean, chances are any of you who are listening right now, you probably have some interest in creationism, the creation evolution sort of conversation, and you've maybe heard of many famous young Earth creationists, whether you're a creationist or not, and you're wondering who's Hans Madueme? He hasn't written a whole lot in the young Earth creationist literature. He's a professor at Covenant College, which is a school, a private Christian college of the Presbyterian Church of America, of which I've been a member of that denomination for many years. My wife went to Covenant College for several years, and so I'm familiar with the college, and I've known a couple of professors there. He is a professor at, as I just mentioned, at Covenant College, been there for a few years. And as he says, one of the reasons you may not have heard him before is because he's a recent convert to young Earth creationism. I think that's interesting in itself. You don't hear of too many people who have something of a career and then convert to young Earth creationism and become a defender of young Earth creationism. So I think that his perspective here is kind of interesting because he comes into it from sort of a from the outside, and now he's studying the inner workings of young Earth creationism. And just to let you know what's going to happen here, he's going to give you sort of the inside scoop as to observation or he's going to give you some inside observations about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the young Earth creationist world from a sort of, loving angle of like, hey, I'm a young Earth creationist, but I want to reform us, right? We need to reform the way we do things and become better young Earth creationists. So it's a challenge, and it's appropriate in the first issue of this journal, which is the New Creation, right, journal, to be suggesting this is a new way of operating for young Earth creationists. And so he said he's helping to set the stage for that. So let's just get right to it. I joined the movement 8 years ago. So only 8 years ago is when he finally, saw the light in terms of young Earth creationism. Before 2023, I had never attended a creationist conference. All right, so 8 years ago is a lot longer than before 2023. So not until 2023 did he really, start to really get involved in the young Earth creationist world. Nor had I ever written anything for ICR, AIG, CMI, or CRS. I lacked the pedigree of many creationist stalwarts who have toiled for decades during a long and bitter winter. So you may wonder, who am I to be giving these remarks? A perfectly appropriate start, right? who am I to, like, who you don't know, to be giving this big talk? This was originally a talk he gave at a creationist conference about what is the future of young earth creation, or what is the state of young earth creationism. Well, thanks for asking. I'm a systematic theologian from the PCA. He's a young earth creationist. I believe in 6 creation days, 6 literal creation days, a universe 6 to 10,000 years old. Interesting tossing in the 10,000 years there, since there are many young earth creationists that actually are critical of even expanding it to 10,000 years and say that that's specifically, I'm thinking of Bodhi Hodge, who basically wrote an article saying it's heretical to say 10,000 years. But nonetheless, I digress. And a past global flood. And those are that's the list of basic tenets, right, that gives you the moniker of young earth creationist. I hold many other convictions related to creationism that are controversial in academia today, but fully within the mainstream of Christian orthodoxy down through the ages. I have many friends and colleagues who are old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists, and he is notable for his conversations that he's had with many other creationists of various forms. And I dream of the day when we'll all be young age creationists. Young age creationists, by the way, is kind of the preferred term of many of the new creationists that we're going to be talking about here. Creationism, after all, is the most compelling theological synthesis of the biblical witness, or so I would argue. Yes, he would argue that. I would certainly not argue that. I would say it's not at all the most compelling theological synthesis. So he's going to make some remarks. Like I said, I'm not going to read every single word of these. I'm going to try to restrain myself to the quotes that I picked out before, but really this entire article is pretty juicy and full of good insight. If you spend any time, we're going to get starting off, with a bang in this article. The quirks of personality. He's saying up here, I just said I wasn't going to read all, but now I have to tell you what he said just before this. He has 5 areas of concern that keep him awake at night. Okay. What are those 5 areas of concern? The quirks of personality. If you spend any time with creationists, you're probably all too familiar with weird personality quirks. These men and women can be sharp-edged, prickly, and combative in personality. They can take offense easily. They can be difficult to work with. Even when you're squarely on their side, they're often too hypersensitive. They are predictably skeptical of the conclusions of mainstream science, but their skepticism is pervasive, extending even to fellow creationists. They end up distrustful of their motives, and I can't read. Sorry. They end up distrustful of the motives and the intentions of other creationists and their ministries. What do you think? Does that ring true with anyone who really knows a number of young earth creationists? Yeah, that sounds like an apt description of many young earth creationists and many comments about young earth creationism in terms of their inability to sort of get along with each other. One of my friends, a creationist, is unwilling to change his views on any theological position, even when it's objectively the right thing to do. Even when it is just crystal clear that you are absolutely wrong, even on a theological position. It's so hard to change people's minds once they become convinced that this is an essential or important idea, that and it becomes more important for you to change everyone else's mind than have anyone change your mind. He suffers from what I call cognitive or intellectual self-righteousness. I think that's a good description. He knows creationism is the kosher position and that non-creationists are wrong on the main points, right? What young earth creationists have you met who doesn't know that non-creationists are wrong on all the main points, right? They have the Bible, the clear and plain evidence, at least from their perspective, and therefore they know they're right. And so you start with this, I'm standing on the truth, and it would be wrong for me to ever be moved from that. So far, so good. But then he acts as if everything he believes, like every position that he has, every position that he holds must be correct, and that a non-creationist can't be right on any substantive issues at all. This way of thinking is false. I know many creationists who believe things that are demonstrably untrue, and they could learn a great deal from non-creationists. All right, we go on. If you're a creation scientist and you've done significant work, you're likely a pioneer. So here's this observation of sort of like where some young earth creationists are at in terms of how they got to where they're at. Well, what makes a creationist still a young earth creationist after many years? Well, likely you're a pioneer in some sort of field. You're striking it out on your own because you're going to be surrounded by people who disagree with you, right? You're an independent thinker. Right, it's almost a given. You're going to be like a different sort of thinker than others, and you're going to be very proud of the fact that you think differently and understand differently. And given that strong personality, you're likely stubborn, right? Probably not known for being a team player. Of course, there are happy exceptions to these stereotypes, especially in the younger generation. Now he puts that in there because the New Creation blog is a bunch of very young college age students, graduate students who have sort of this new perspective of sort of like, being more appreciative of the science and respectful of other people's positions and willing to have dialogue. Actually, I'm ahead of myself. We're going to get to those points where he's going to start quoting me in this particular article. And so we'll talk about those when I get there. But I'll just point out here, he's identifying that there is a certain type of younger generation, young earth creationist that is different than this older generation. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And then he goes into some admonishment and biblical rationale for why this behavior is something that we need to rein in as young earth creationists and help and overcome. But one final point on personality quirks. We should distinguish eccentric from awkward. Every movement has eccentric personalities, right? The oddballs. Yes, every movement does, right? Bunch of oddball, especially in all areas of scientific endeavors. There's a whole bunch of eccentric scientists out there. It's probably fair to say that creationism has a higher proportion of such people. Okay, and for some of those reasons he just mentioned in terms of how they got to where they're at, it's in a way you kind of need to be eccentric and you need to be independent and you need to be stubborn in order to maintain a view which is unpopular in the world around you, right? I think we can all be sympathetic to someone who thinks completely differently than most around them, in which case they're constantly being confronted with claims that they're wrong, and it's hard to hold up against that without having this strong personality. The bigger problem, however, lies with those creationists who tend to be awkward, right? You got your eccentrics, but there are ones that are awkward, individuals that struggle to work with others. The issue is prevalent in creationism for the reasons mentioned already, same type of reasons. Creationism is a movement that needs team players and leaders who can handle the occasional disagreements within the team. Awkwardness is a character trait that can be addressed and improved upon, right? See, he's trying to at least offer some encouragement here. This is something that is maybe something that you can actually train yourself out of, and we can help each other become less awkward. At the individual level, we should at least resist the devil's temptations to fall back into combative modes of being. Keep reading widely. And so how might you do that? What are his suggestions? How do you resist the devil's temptations to fall into a combative mode? Keep reading widely. Keep reading people from different perspectives. Don't just read fellow creationists or even conservative Christians. Read people you disagree with. Read people who hate creationism, not merely to refute them. That's easy. Rather to expose your cultural and theological blind spots. This is great advice. This is exactly what Answers in Genesis is not. Answers in Genesis is let's get you into the fold. Do not expose yourself to outside influences. Don't expose yourself to people who have the wrong ideas, that are wrong about all these things. Don't read widely, all right? Don't read people with different perspectives. Or if you do, you're only doing so simply to refute them, to cherry pick stuff from their literature, not to try to understand them. Read people you disagree with. Read people who hate creationism, right? Expose yourself to cultural and theological, your cultural and theological blind spots. This is exactly what many young earth ministries are not doing, is that they are creating, well, sets of literature in order to answer all the questions, so you don't have to go outside of their influence or sphere of influence at all in order to obtain information. But that also means you will lack the ability or the awareness of other viewpoints, even if only to sharpen your own viewpoints by increasing your understanding or your defense of your own position. So he is saying, you gotta talk to other people, right? You have to have communication with those who you disagree with. You have to be able to have conversations. And if you're awkward, all right, and you look inward and you only find solace in those who think exactly like you do. And young earth creationists can't even get along with each other at different institutions. This is how you prevent that, by having a greater appreciation for the wider diversity within the young earth creationist community and outside the young earth creationist community. Don't just read, get to know Christians who think differently from you. And this is one of the things that I would say is different about the new creationist. People like Hans here, Todd Wood, and others that we could list later. Right. And especially a bunch of this younger generation, right? They actually are willing to interact. Well, the thing is, I've interacted with most of these individuals. I've had email exchanges, individual, meetups, personal discussions with these individuals. Have I with other young earth individuals of the other young earth creationist organizations? Not so much. A few maybe formal, clashes through email, but not any personal engagement. In fact, personal engagement is discouraged by especially Answers in Genesis. All right. It's a top-down leadership thing that those who work there really aren't even allowed to have that kind of conversation with those that aren't truly in the fold. Right. That's considered dangerous. It's dangerous to talk to somebody like me. And I do know this from personal experience, and I do know that some of them have been told not to talk to me or to others like me. The most effective remedy is to integrate creationism fully into the life and ministry of the local church. Get involved, get personal, know people individually, become whole, well-rounded people. All right, number 2. We won't spend as much time on all 5 of his areas of concern. Peace with other creationists. True confession, I have mixed feelings about standard creationist ministries. When he says standard creationist ministries, it means AIG, CMI, ICR. Okay? Those would be the 3 biggies. Well, some of them are helpful. Suggesting that some might not be, or might be something less than helpful. Typically, they don't put creationism in the best light. I dislike the tone, the conduct, the infighting, the hyper polemics, all of it. I don't often see the grace and truth of Jesus. He's just speaking the truth there. That's absolutely the observation that I have made from some individuals at other organizations, and really the organizational tone. And he feels it, and the younger creationists, new creationists do. Creationism deserves better. Yeah, sorry, I'm tempted to read all that, but we don't need this to be terribly long. And besides, you're able to read, and I will link this article and you can read the whole thing for yourself. So I'm more here to comment on a few of these points. That said, creationist ministries are not blameless. They tend to be narrow, inflexible, overly dogmatic. It's as if they fear challenge or disagreement from others. I mean, I guess when you've been in disagreement with everyone around you your whole life, and especially if you grow up in academia and you're trying to survive that before you become a young earth creationist, and many do not survive that whole process, you do tend to fear that disagreement. You've been hurt and harmed by it, psychologically damaged by it, and so you're going to tend to want to try to shun that that challenge that you would receive. They double down in reaction, hold their views more stringently, even when those views are not as clear as they think. That is just such a common problem that they get. They double down on really superficial points sometimes and just wrong information. It's hard to correct somebody when they're not willing to listen, all right, to others, and they're so distrustful of others, so they don't even have open ears to hear where they might be wrong. And it's young earth creationists like this that really have the only chance to be able to enter into that world and create some communication and get some people over convince them that some of their arguments are truly fallible. This is a sign of fragility and insecurity, not faithfulness. Doubling down, being really, I'll use the word arrogant, but we'll just say headstrong, is not faithfulness. That's not standing strong for Christ and for the Bible. It can just be a sign of fragility and insecurity. Worse yet, the real issue for some individuals might be their big egos, right? It might be their big ego. In a word, he's calling it out. That's really just sin. Right? We're all sinners. Even if you think you have a better understanding of God's word, that doesn't make you a non-sinner. And so you have to be willing to be able to hear and be called out for that which you are doing wrong. Others have voiced same concern. So I'm not the only one. He's saying I'm not the only one that has raised this concern, especially in the last couple of years. This is something that has been spoken about more. This is one of the most public, introspective views or discussions about young earth creationists by a young earth creationist that I've read. And that's the reason I'm highlighting it here. But they're not the only, Hans isn't the only one that has brought up some of these points. Others have voiced the same concerns. Logos Research Associates, for instance, a creationist organization founded by John Sanford, they published a set of principles to guide their ministry. Yes, this is a fairly recent thing with them. And they even have a statement about how they approach fellowship with non-creationists and other creationists with whom they disagree. Gordon Wilson, who wrote a portion of that, wrote the following: "It's apparent to us that division in creation apologetics movement is widespread." Right? Division within the creation apologetics movement is widespread. I can't deny that is not an accurate statement. What did I just say? I think I can't deny that is an accurate statement. And at times, there has been clear evidence of ungodly actions and sinful anger. Disagreement is not our problem. Discord is. Hey, we're free to disagree with each other. I mean, that's part of dealing with different ideas. We're going to have different ideas and different interpretations, so we're going to disagree. But discord is the problem. Not only does it displease our Lord when we young earth creationists are not open or not on speaking terms with each other, it's poor testimony to the watching world. Yes, absolutely. I mean, you know it. I mean, many of you would sense that. Many of you well outside the young earth creationist environment and even creationist environment or Christian environment would see the actions of many young earth Christians as being hypocritical to what they claim they believe. And then more recently, the Creation Theological Society sounded the alarm bells in 2023 in an online document titled A Call to Unity, garnering a list of creationist signatories. The document was promoted by a growing alarm over rank divisiveness emanating from certain sectors of creationism. I quote the 2 of the 9 commitments. And then, here's things that they say they're going to be committing to try to call for unity. As we enter into discussions, present our papers, and publish our findings, we should season our words with grace, love, and respect for fellow believers, no matter how much we might disagree with one another. Evidently, Logos Research Associates and the Creation Theological Society feel compelled to urge all creationists to be consistently Christ-centered in the word and deed. For them to publicly write these articles such that you and I can see what they're saying about each other means that behind the scenes they've been unable to create any traction in creating unity, and they see that the problems are growing and they feel compelled to publicly call it out. The relevant point is this: not all disagreements are equally serious. Not all differences of opinion are heretical. Christians throughout church history acknowledged some notion of dogmatic rank, the idea that teachings need to be ranked, and the ranking has to do with the importance for faithfulness and fellowship. Not all teachings we hold have the same importance, although all biblical teaching is important. Yeah, that reminds me of a really excellent book by Gavin Ortland, who is a Christian apologist and has a YouTube channel that I follow, Finding the Right Hills to Die On. And it's basically an analysis of the Christian doctrines and which ones are the ones that, like, you know, these are the hills that you should fight, all right, for. All right. But there's a whole bunch of things that people have made hills to die on that aren't worth dying on, right? They are not unimportant. They need to be discussed, but we need to have Christian charity, and we're going to recognize there's going to be diversity of thought. And we shouldn't make that the central issue of the Christian faith. I think that's the spirit that Hans Madueme is seeking here, is something like what Gavin Ortland has written here and has spoken about. He has a couple YouTube videos about this. You know, I'm not saying creationists should never engage in healthy debate or disagreement. There's a time and place for dispute, right? I think we'd all agree with that, you know, on a number of different issues, you know, things that are happening in politics and so forth today. There are places where we need to hash it out, but there is an appropriate way to do that. Number 3, the promise of the new creationism. In evangelicalism, the relationship between church and academia is always fragile. Believers often have a dismissive view of academic institutions as embodying all the sins of secularism, right? I mean, this is what you would hear from Ken Ham just every day, all day long. This sentiment runs deep in American history and culture. The conservative wing of American Protestantism often has a smug anti-intellectual suspiciousness, all right, of universities and PhDs. While I disavow this attitude, I recognize there's much to criticize about academic institutions. I do too. I mean, I would disavow that attitude, but I also would say that there's a whole lot to criticize about academic institutions. Anti-biblical ideologies are taught and defended in lecture halls across the country. At the same time, we should recognize the vital role that Christian colleges, seminaries, and parachurch organizations have played in the lives of believers. Influential professors train and mentor our young people. Seminaries train future pastors for the next generation. What such institutions are saying about creation matters a lot. Now, what do institutions like seminaries and so forth say about creationism? Well, that's part of the problem. This is where I think Hans sees his primary role in creationism itself and the future of creationism. The reality is this: most professors at these institutions have an extremely low view of creationist ministries. Yes, I mean, Ken Ham can only list on one hand, basically, the seminaries and large Christian colleges that you should attend that have professors and stated policies that are favorable toward young earth creationism. Right? Some schools have young earth creationists, but they don't necessarily have a like thou shalt must be a young earth creationist and teach and preach that in order to work here. There's only a few of them that are that way. They find them intellectually embarrassing, distasteful, and dishonoring to the Lord. Some readers will be thinking, well, hey, professor, they're liberals. That's why they don't like creationist ministries. You haven't heard that before, have you? From followers of Ken Ham and so forth, and other many young earth creationist believers, right? Those liberal professors, even if they're at a Christian college, they've been liberalized by their own they've been brought up in academia, and therefore they just don't like creation ministries, and that's why they have a low view of them. And here's where Hans comes in. He says, with all due respect, that is a lazy response, and that's exactly what that is. It is just a lazy response. It's a broad brush, get me out of jail sort of thing. Like somebody's making this argument. I'm just like, yeah, but they're liberal professors and they just don't like us. So that's why they dismiss our views. It is true that professors often accept old earth and evolutionary perspectives, hence their disagreement with creationist ministries. However, we cannot ignore the ambiguous legacy of creationist organizations. In other words, creationist organizations have not exactly been of the highest caliber with respect to their academic standards. Hence, one of the reasons for this new journal, by the way. It's okay. I mean, that's made pretty clear in another article about why we need a new creationist journal, is that the quality of creationist papers is not so good in some other journals. Stuff slips through that shouldn't be slipping through. And so essentially what he's saying is like, you know what, there's a reason why professors at some other institutions might have a low view of creation ministries. There's a reason why they find them intellectually embarrassing, distasteful, and dishonoring. Because they feel like they're not making effective arguments. And they see the attitude that they have. They see how they treat each other. It's all the things he's been talking about. That's the impression that people have of young earth creationists. They're belligerent, stubborn, can't get along with anybody, right? So we can't ignore the ambiguous legacy of creationist organizations. Yay, on the one hand, they've done a lot of good, but on the other hand, frankly speaking, they have shortcomings and limitations. See above, everything I've talked about so far. Given this cultural moment, creationist ministries stand no chance with Christian academic institutions. I say that without malice or glee. I wish it were otherwise. And yet, if we believe that young earth creationism is the most faithful articulation of Scripture, that it most closely aligns with the Catholic, small c, Catholic tradition, then it is integral to the whole structure of Christian theology. If this is true, then we cannot be satisfied with the current situation. Something's got to change. Right? And that change includes changing ourselves, not just like you got it all wrong, fix yourself, or let's get rid of you. It's like we got to do something different. Obviously, we're not raising up generations of individuals that are able to turn this tide. It's here that the new creationism holds great promise for the future of the movement. Okay, so now here we're getting into the new creationist stuff. The British geologist Paul Garner used the phrase in the title of his 2009 book, The New Creationism. And this Week in Creationism episode that I just recorded a while back, I show a copy of Paul Garner's book. Actually, Paul Garner sent me a copy of his book after 2001 when I did this whole series on my blog, The New Creationist. Basically saying like, hey, I've used that term before. Back in 2009, give me some credit. Paul is way too nice of a guy. Yes, I've met Paul Garner in person and talked to him, and we've had multiple different email exchanges. He's way too nice of a guy to have actually said what I just said, but he's right in the sense of like, I had not considered that book and given it enough credit. I still think that, what I'm saying about this movement as new creationism is more fleshed out, and I don't think is visible necessarily in 2009. And I'm not sure he was necessarily casting this as a new thing, but there are elements certainly in that book, and it's sort of like, the new creationism. The book introduced readers to the most interesting scientific developments within creationism at the time. Some years later, Joel Duff, a professor of biology at the University of Akron, mapped out a new movement within creationism with different emphases from mainstream creationist ministries. He called this the new creationism. Joel Duff hails from the same denomination as mine, Presbyterian Church of America. Just Parenthetically, I need to add here, I said that, I've been a member of the PCA, and I've been a long-term member of the Presbyterian Church of America. And my father is a pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which is a very closely allied denomination with the PCA. But I am not actually a member of the PCA currently. That's another story for another time. He disavows the young earth position, which means we disagree on a host of origins-related issues. Yeah, we would disagree on a number of things. However, Duff knows more about the history and current state of creationism than most creationists, no hyperbole, and he has done creationists a great service by drawing attention to the new creationism. This is a very kind, completely unnecessary thing to say by Hans. I would say that I do know more about this current state and the history of creationism than a lot of young earth creationists, but certainly not all of them. Definitely not Todd Wood. He's an encyclopedia of knowledge on the history of creationism. If creationism has any future in Christian colleges and seminaries and among people influenced by such institutions, the new creationism stands a chance to reach such an audience. And I've been saying that. I've been saying, the current state of creationism and the current methodology of creationism and the current arguments that young earth creationists make, like current being sort of like state-of-the-art Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, they're never going to die out. I know some people say, they'll disappear. I think that they'll continue in some form, but they're never going to see great success. That particular methodology, that particular Christian apologetic method, not going to be a long-term successful strategy. It might have some short-term gain. Like a lot of things, strong rhetoric can have a short-term gain, but it creates long-term damage. And so creationists need to pivot to a different strategy. Ultimately, I think they're wrong, right? And I think their hypothesis is incorrect and their interpretation of Scripture is incorrect, and therefore it can't truly have success. But for those who believe that in young earth creationists and truly desire to see that particular understanding of the world become a more prominent view, like as I said before, their current strategy not working and won't work. They need another method, and I think this other one has at least a chance to have more influence in the long run. The future of creationism lies with the new creationism. Do not misunderstand, we need mainstream creationist organizations defending the cause in their lane. In other words, they do have some purpose. They're large organizations. They reach a lot of people, and they do have some strategies that are necessary. But still think saying the majority of how they function and their arguments aren't necessarily that great. My intention is not to split the creationist community into another us versus them divide. I totally understand that's not his intention. It's kind of hard to imagine, given the personality types and everything he said about the way many young earth creationists are wired. It's kind of hard to understand how that doesn't happen. I guess, through prayer and really working with people, you can transform things. And, that would be the hope. And that's the thing you strive for. But it just, put the truth serum in me and ask, whether that's really going to be successful. It seems doubtful without a miracle. Rather, we should recognize that the mainstream community of the new creationist community operate at different levels within the broader creationist movement. So he is trying to make sort of there can be different ways of approaching creation apologetics. Maybe this will work for some people, and maybe we need other ways, though, to reach other people. For the good of the church and the flourishing of creationism, I am increasingly convinced we need far more scientists and theologians operating in the new creationism lane. Now, this is a really important point. Why didn't I highlight that? Boom, highlighted. Because what's happening with young earth creationism? There's fewer scientists. Just go look at Answers in Genesis. They got a couple perfunctory scientists there. ICR has a fair number of, I guess we'll call them scientists. We'll call them, academically trained, right? And then there's even fewer theologians. right? I mean, there's Christians, but there's a difference between just like I'm a Christian and I'm a Christian apologist. Theologians are one dedicated to understanding who God is, and in a fairly I'll call it an academic way. So let me highlight key characteristics of new creationists summarized by Duff on his blog Naturalis Historia. And so, yes, these are shortened summaries of what I listed as the characteristics of a new creationist. More gracious in dialogue with other creationists, willing to engage with non-young earth creationists, non-young earth Christians. Most of them have engaged with me, and I know they've engaged with multiple other non-young earth creationists, including members of Reasons to Believe, all right, and other old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists, even individuals from Biologos. So they have been more willing to have actual real conversations with those individuals. They treat Christians with other views as misinformed rather than as compromisers. I don't know if you've ever heard Ken Ham call somebody a compromiser. Yeah, it happens all the time. That's the label. If you're not exactly with us and don't have subscribed to our complete statement of faith, you're a compromiser, right? I've been labeled exactly that, a compromiser, by Answers in Genesis. And once you're labeled a compromiser, you're really not supposed to have any interaction with that individual, because they've compromised. They're actually under the control of Satan. Right. And therefore, if you pay attention, if you talk to them, you're actually letting Satan's words come to you. So it's best to keep them away. That's the ultimate way that we'll say that's how cults operate, right? That's how they keep other ideas out. You don't listen to those other ideas. That is a difference. That's why that was my number one, item. That was my first thing I thought of when I thought about what makes this group of individuals different than this other group of individuals, or these organizations different than these other organizations. And I constantly come to this particular conclusion. They're more likely to be involved in academia than be employed by a large creationist ministry. Yep. All right. A lot of the fringe around the large creation ministries, right? Your Answers in Genesis are you're like a full-time employee and that's your job, as opposed to I work at a Christian college. I work at a Christian university. I work in some other parachurch organization, and I have an interest in young earth creationism, and I'm promoting it, or I'm studying it, but I'm studying it from outside of I'm employed, as that's my major job is to be a young earth creationist. They're more comfortable applying an academic approach to questions that entails application of testing and criticizing ideas, rather than relying on fideistic tendencies and creation dogmatism. More comfortable not having an answer to every question, as opposed to the Answers book, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, and so forth. Like every question that gets asked to us, here's the answer. And the answers are rarely nuanced, right? They're rarely could be this, could be that, we think this, but we leave room for that. No, it's here's your answer. They're more likely to say, I don't know, holding out hope that their work will stimulate future answers. You got a compelling point there. I don't really have a great answer for that particular evidence or an interpretation that really fits the data that well now. But I believe that in the future, that's why we're going to continue to study this, and we're looking for and trying to come up with alternative explanations, rather than just doubling down and saying, we're right, here's the answer. More driven by curiosity of creation, desire to understand the world, not simply content to poke holes in conventional theories. They seek to be forward-thinking and develop creationist models, faithful both to available data and to Scripture. This whole idea of being curious, that's another thing that's just, to me, pretty obvious. Most of these younger new creationists, they actually love science. They love astronomy. They like geology. They like exploring. They actually are out in nature. They're just they're fascinated by the world, and they actually think that new discoveries are really cool, right? even ones that are really challenging to understand within a young earth creationist framework, they're like, this is part of God's world and this is like super cool. You just do not get that sense from, especially from Answers in Genesis. I'm not saying that everyone Answers in Genesis doesn't, is not, doesn't find the world fascinating. But there are many that it's kind of a tool. It's kind of like something like, oh boy, we got to come up with an answer or response to how do we understand this? It's like a chore. It feels like a chore. Like, how do I just, they're not rejoicing in some new thing that's found. They're just sort of like, okay, now how do I squeeze this in? More willing to acknowledge the substantial empirical evidence for evolution from multiple fields, including biology, paleontology, genetics, biogeography, and so on. Multiple new creationists are willing to say, yeah, you've got a lot of evidence there. There's a lot of evidence that can be interpreted as supportive of something like evolutionary biology, or certainly of an old Earth, right? They're not denying that a lot of the evidence might simply be able to be interpreted that way. It simply is wrong. And we're trying to find an alternative explanation. So it goes back to what I just said before. We're confident that that interpretation must be wrong because of our presuppositional, holding to a particular view of scriptures that we don't feel like we can give up. And so therefore, we think we have what we know is the basic framework of an answer, but we don't have all the details just yet. Now, I know many of you watching this are like, well, yeah, you're never going to get those details. It's never going to work, and all the evidence is against you. But at least the new creationists at least they're kind of willing at different points to say, like, yeah, there's a whole lot of data that's been collected that seems to point in this direction. And I am working, and it's like, it's going to be a hard job, but, I'm going to try to actually convince you with an alternative scenario that tries to make sense of the same data you're looking at. As opposed to just Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham just dismissive of everything and just making statements like all the evidence points to a young Earth, and you'd have to be blind not to see it. Like, not recognizing that there are just sort of intuitive, simple pieces of things that are most easily interpreted as supporting an old Earth, and saying, well, that's the way it looks, but we're gonna figure that out. Yeah, sorry, this is getting a little long, so let me try to scoot through here. Less likely to fear or discourage new discoveries. While discoveries pose challenges to new creationists, they find the challenges exciting rather than daunting. Sorry, just said that already. I agree with Duff that the new creationists are not yet a monolithic group. All right, I say in that article that, yes, these are some characteristics that I find that unifies them, but they're all still a whole bunch of separate individuals. A lot of them are independent researchers and have jobs at various Christian colleges, or maybe they truly are actual independent, like they're just a scientist and they're doing this thing on their own. They're not employed by any particular group or affiliated, but they all have like these characteristics, and they generally can get along with each other a whole lot better because of these particular underlying beliefs. But they're not a substantial group. But by the way, this is why I'm bringing up this particular article, because since 2021, I think that this group has kind of come together a little bit more into a little bit more cohesive group, because I think that they all feel kind of out of place with the rest of the young Earth creationist community, partly because many have been called out by Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis for being compromisers. Right. Within the creationist community, they've been criticized, right? This sharp criticism is real, right? There's a whole set of articles by Answers in Genesis called the Young Earth Evolution, in which they call out many of these individuals as being compromisers to young Earth creation. And so just by virtue of being outed in that way, they have sort of now like congealed a little bit. And I will say that this new journal, the launching of this new journal, might, right, become sort of a central ground around which or the kernel around which this new group might become a little bit more connected. right, and have a somewhat larger voice. Because right now they're pretty much drowned out, right? And part of the reason they're drowned out is because they're essentially blacklisted from publishing in some other Creationist journals, and not given what little grant money there is, and they're not going to have any chance of becoming, if they wanted to. And unfortunately, for some of the young members of this generation, which are now associated with older members of the New Creationists, that might prohibit them from actually getting jobs as full-time young earth creationists at the major organizations, in which case they're not going to be influence those organizations. So this is creating a wedge and a separation into two sort of types of creationists with two different methodologies. Nor are they wholly different species from other creationists. Of course, there's a whole bunch of overlap. I mean, they agree on the essentials, like the core beliefs are right there in common. Nonetheless, they represent a less combative way of articulating and defending creationism in the 21st century. Now, I don't know if that method is going to work in the temporal short-term sense, given the nature of our discourse in this country, in which loud, strong takes and doubling down on your position are the way that seems to be like everything works. All right, the ones that are heard the most and gather the largest followings are those that are the most outspoken. And I don't want to go any farther. All right, I don't want to start getting off on a tangent there. I think you know where I'm going. If we want to reach people informed about the scientific evidence against creationism, including college graduates, seminary trained pastors, new creationism has more resonance and persuasive power. And I guess that's kind of my commentary here. It's like, I think it should. And I think that it does have a chance to make inroads in sort of like that academia area a little bit more, and among pastors and churches and maybe some theologians. It's just that we live in an environment now where that's even becoming difficult for anyone to be a rational, patient person, right? Playing the long game of like getting to know people and actually having communication. Right? That's just not. I'll say it's maybe valued, but it's so hard to do, and it shows so little success that we go for the caustic, flamboyant outrage material. Mainstream creationism cannot deliver on that front. Right? That's a pretty strong claim there. Right? Mainstream creationist ministries are not going to deliver getting theologians, changing the hearts of many who are thoughtful people. Let's skip down here. So the fourth thing, I'll do this really quickly, because he has a whole bunch of stuff just a little more philosophical, like talking about epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How do we come to know things? It's a simplistic epistemology that leads to theological imbalance. Creationists who think this way assume that whatever their side believes on origins and a raft of related issues are the sober truth, and they dismiss critics because they have the wrong assumptions. You ever heard that before? Your assumptions are wrong, right? Your presuppositions are incorrect, and therefore you've built a foundation on the wrong assumptions. But this position is implausible on its face. It is a false assumption that everything creationists believe about science is true, and whatever secular scientists and Christian evolutionists believe is wrong. Right? And that's what happens, is like everything you believe is wrong because you start out with some assumption, and therefore everything you believe is completely wrong. I mean, everybody has certain assumptions about the way the world operates that are probably not perfectly correct. And therefore, they've built some other things on those, but it doesn't mean they've gone completely and totally awry. Right? Truth can find, besides, we're all inconsistent too. We're just inconsistent. If you drill down on something you believe, you might find out, actually, that's inconsistent with something else that I think is a fundamental assumption of mine. Because this assumption works for this other thing I believe, but this assumption doesn't work for this other thing that I believe. But I'm going to keep this assumption because it helps me there, but not over there. Right? We're all inconsistent. And that's part of the reason why it's completely impossible. It's a false assumption that what every creationist believes about science is true. and whatever secular scientists believe is wrong. And that's often the starting point in this conversation about epistemology. How do we know what's true? Like, well, I start with the Bible, so therefore I'm right about everything. You didn't start with the Bible, therefore you're wrong about everything. Well, old earth creationists also start with the Bible. Many other Christians who don't believe in young earth creationism also, Bible is a big assumption there, and if not a primary assumption. It's different interpretations. And then we have to start talking about the assumptions about interpretive principles for Scripture. Okay, skipping through a whole bunch more. It's all really good stuff. We don't have time to do it all because it's already been 1 hour and 2 minutes. In recent decades, the most exciting work in creationism is from scientists. Here he's going to complain about the fact that where are the theologians? Where are the theologians out there defending young earth creationism? I think this is a very good observation. I've made this observation before in different ways, but not as starkly as Hans is going to do here. And I've said that from my perspective, the reason they're missing is because it's not defensible, right? There are very few young earth creationist theologians, because theologians who have spent a large time studying the genre and think about the interpretation principles of Scripture and think about systematic theology, or in my case, a biblical theological approach to Scriptures, don't find young earth creationism to be helpful, at least that form, the type of interpretive principles you have to use to get young earth creationism, a young earth, aren't helpful for understanding the rest of Scripture. In fact, they make many things more difficult. As to create a cohesive understanding of the entire arc of history. I cannot say the same for creationists who are biblical scholars and theologians. They are missing in action. I realize, of course, that Creation Ministries are publishing biblical and theological resources with the associated strengths and weaknesses noted earlier. Important essays have appeared, there's been some essays, and there are some monographs and some various books. All right. But compounding the issue, very little creationist writing of any note is published in mainstream evangelical settings. And he's right. IVP, Zondervan, Crossway, all these big Christian publishers, they're not really publishing creation science stuff. In my own field of systematic theology, I can only count on one hand the number of top-tier creationist essays published in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, I will say that in some ways, there are a couple Christian publishers that have become specialists in young earth creationist publishing. And so therefore it's easiest to get published there. And so the publishing world is difficult. And so young earth creationists are going to tend to just go to where they know they can get published. And so there's been a separation into different areas of publishing, such that those are the go-to, especially master books. I mean, that's essentially the publishing arm of Answers in Genesis. None of their stuff is published anywhere else, and it doesn't appear they ever try to publish anywhere else. For some reason, most Christians think there's nothing new to say about creationism from a theological perspective. I have heard this from young earth creationists. It's like, I'll say, like, look, there's all these books about interpretation of Genesis and evaluations of that, and really fascinating stuff over the last 20 years. Has been an enormous amount of literature from a evolutionary creationist perspective, from an old earth perspective, from a variety of different ways, interpretations of Genesis. And I'll say, well, that's because, the simplest interpretation is young earth creationism, and it's straightforward. And, Henry Morris and others wrote about it in the past. And we're done. The theology is done. We understand it. There's nothing more that really can be said other than just print the same thing over again. Now, this is again why I brought this article up. In the minds, the main issues are easy and settled. Case closed. Why do we need to publish 10 more books on that? But this view is muddled on at least two fronts. The first becomes clear if we reflect on theology more generally. Even though Christian orthodoxy has stable creeds and confessions, theology itself, unlike Scripture, is not static, but always answers fresh questions for every new generation and cultural context. Since creationism has no creeds and confessions, that's even more reason to be articulating creationism afresh for new generations. But where are those theologians and biblical scholars? Yeah, where are they? I mean, I know the world of creationism pretty well, and I'm struggling here to come up with a couple theologians I can tell you about who have written extensively on young Earth creationism. I mean, I guess Boyd, and then Creation and Change was an important young Earth creationist defense, but that was 1990 or 93 or 94, something like that. I'm blanking on the author right now. He was at Reformed Theological Seminary. I don't know. He's probably retired by now. So, yeah, where are they? I mean, Gary North had written some stuff in defense of young Earth creationism way back when, but he's kind of out of the game. Yeah, I'm struggling. I really am. It's like I've got, well, you can't see it behind me. My bookshelf behind me here is loaded with, I probably have 45 to 50 books that are all just, about Genesis and theological treatises on Genesis. And only two of them have a young Earth creationist perspective. I mean, there's a couple 4 views book, and in one of those views is young Earth creationism. That seems to be the only place it gets defended these days. So he's spot on here. It's like no theologians are really doing work in this area to further explore and try to understand better, because there's all kinds of questions. There's all kinds of things that, how do I understand a variety of different difficult passages that many people like Ken Ham have just kind of like have really oversimplified responses to, that deserve so much more attention that they don't get. It's not static, but it answers fresh questions. Where are the theologians and biblical scholars who defend young Earth creationism? They really should be the really important ones. You say that the essential assumption of young Earth creationism is that the Bible is true and we're right in our interpretation. You think that defending that interpretation should be absolutely core and central to your mission. Second, it's misleading to say creationism is a settled theological tradition. Lots of interesting questions still have no good answers. I just said that. Also, creationism potentially has insights on theological and exegetical questions that have puzzled non-creationists for decades. It's not settled theological tradition. There are things that people never thought about up until the last couple of 100 years, because of science and other things, have raised questions about interpretations of things about creation and origins and origins of man and how we are as we are, our beings and our natures. That's a very active area. And young Earth creationists are not active in that discussion. Just to be clear, I'm not saying we need to be quoting Bible verse. More citing scripture text is not the same thing as doing theology. And this is a theologian speaking, right? Defending theology, which I actually very much agree with. Endless attention to word studies and grammar will only get us so far. We need theology. Right? That's the holistic approach of applying the Word of God to your lives. We need to draw out theological richness of the biblical story in synthetic ways that connect with people. Where is creationist theological reflection on incarnation anyway? Christologies that are on the rise in academia. What about creationist perspectives on the nature of language and linguistic diversity and how they relate to the Babel account in Genesis 11, 1 through 9? And where are creationists wrestling theologically, not just culturally or politically, with difficult questions about gender dysphoria, transgender ideology, and the connection to the biblical teaching that human bisexuality is binary? Yeah, yes, you hear Ken Ham talk about gender like constantly, but not from any deep theological sense. It's a very superficial thing. It's just like, we know the truth and here's what you should believe, not really grappling with real life issues in many cases. These questions only scratch the surface. Christian theologians can serve the global church in distinctively orthodox and penetrating ways. You might respond that mainstream publishers are often anti-creationist, or at least reluctant to publish creationist books. I have no qualms publishing volumes on theistic evolution, or they have no qualms on it. But we creationists get no such love. However, we should not heap all the blame on evangelical publishers. While anecdotal, I have had private conversations with some publishers who are open to creationist projects if they are competent. Key word there, right? Let me just highlight that 10 times until you can't see it. If they are competent. Furthermore, some of us who write in mainstream settings have decided it's not worth investing time and scholarship defending creationism. That was me, but now I think that was a mistake. So we need good creationist theology. If we keep regurgitating the same arguments in creationist echo chambers, will we end up only preaching to the choir? In any case, most evangelicals who are not creationists will never be exposed to that material, and this is the biggest shame, they'll never encounter, much less feel it in their bones, the theological vitality of creationism. I would say that, yes, that is the feeling you get from Answers in Genesis. I know I keep saying Answers in Genesis. I mean, it's a number of people, but yeah, if your Answers in Genesis is like it's sort of like just a defense thing for those who are already Christians, and just need quick, easy answers to like help remove the things that might be troubling them, right? It's like, oh, I've been asked all these questions, or people keep asking me about this, and oh, okay, you got the answers for me, good. Rather than really drawing them out and helping them actually have a wide appreciation for creation. More pragmatically, some of us need to be writing in mainstream settings, if only because it will challenge us to wrestle with the gaps and problems on our own side, figuring out where we need to strengthen our position and learn from the others. We need theologians in the fray in academic conferences, making the case to our critics that with patient humility and deep conviction. I mean, I might be going to the Evangelical Theological Society coming up, and gonna hopefully go to a bunch of talks. I doubt there'll be many young earth creationist related talks there at all. All of this is healthy for the creationist movement and things that aren't being done. Some will worry about the inherent dangers of my proposal. If creationists are now bending over backwards to get published at Crossway and PNR, well, isn't the tail will be wagging the dog? It can become a creationist crutch to keep producing sophomoric theology that will not stand up to scrutiny. In other words, if you're not going to try to get published in good journals and at good publishers, then maybe it's because your stuff isn't good enough. Enough. We can't keep hiding behind the cry, we're the persecuted minority. Instead of whining, we must raise our game. I don't need to tell you it's hard to be a creationist in academia. Yeah, I can imagine. It must be very hard. Blood and tears, all sweat, no glory. But I remain unflinchingly optimistic. Young earth creationism is the future of Christian theology, and the truth is on our side. I mean, you have to believe that to continue to persist in this very difficult environment, right? Where is creationism headed in the coming decades? What will come to mind will sound like a tired cliche, but I'm dead serious. The best days of creationism is still very much ahead of us. So Hans, despite a whole lot of criticism of other young earth creationists, or with it, criticism of the young earth creationist community in general, is still positive that because it's true, the best days have to be ahead. The best days are not right now. There is a lot of angst among many young earth creationists and discouragement about sort of the state of creationism right now. I mean, from Answers in Genesis perspective, many people might see that as winning, and you might look at that and see them as winning because you see a very large organization with actually growing influence, and there's so many people that take that in. But I think that most young earth creationists who are long-term like leaders aren't necessarily terribly encouraged by where things are at. And I think you can see that in Ken Ham. He seems increasingly desperate both to find a successor, where's the next generation coming? He keeps asking that, like, where's the next generation? Where are the next great leaders in young earth creationism, or just creationism in general? So it seems like he understands that, what he thought, if he built a huge organization, have all these followers, and we got this much money, we should be able to like take over the world, right? We should be able to convince everybody of this, of creationism. And it seems like they're just as much a minority in terms of having real influence than they have been before. And so I think that has to be discouraging. Okay, I think it's time to call it quits. This whole article is really well worth reading. It's very introspective about the state of creationism. I'm sure that this article has made a lot of other young earth creationists probably not happy. But from my perspective, this had to be said. This is the only way to actually create some movement within young earth creationism and save its future. Because I agree, going down the same road of what Answers in Genesis and ICR and so forth have been doing is a road fraught with many problems, and is a dying path. And so for me, and I've been saying this pretty consistently for the last few years, this new creationism is the only path forward for young earth creationism. I don't think it'll be successful, but I still think it's a much better option than the alternative. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thanks for hanging out with me on a long trip through the state of creationism. We'll talk to you on the other side. Bye-bye.